Okay, in this video we're going to talk a little bit about how Fossil is able to communicate with servers or other repositories in general. So from the last episode we opened the user interface that Fossil has, and in this case I'm actually visiting a website that is a remote repository, so it's a repository that's being hosted on a server, and it has a similar invocation to the UI command, except it's meant to be run as a server, and you can see the interface is very similar. Some of the options are missing because I'm not logged in, but you can see that very similar layout. What you want is the URL up here. If you go up to Fossil and then nailcode, that is the name of the repository. Everything after this, where the /doc starts, that's actually a page within the repository itself. So if we were to take this, we can actually interact with this repository. So for this, we're going to make a clone of this so that we can work with all the source code, and eventually, because we do have a login for this, we can actually push changes back to this, and then they'll show up on the timeline and everything like that. So before we get into that, it should also be noted how remote repositories work on Fossil. It's actually very similar to Git. With more traditional version control systems, you would have a central server, and any changes that are made by a computer would require you to check out the files, and then you make your changes, and then in order to commit them, committing is actually the same as going back to the server and pushing them back to the server. So if you have two people who have the same checkout at the same time, it makes it really easy to have a collision or a conflict between files this way. What Git and similar systems do now is a distributed model. So every computer actually has a full, not just one checkout, it actually has the entire database. So we're going to be using a server computer in order to clone from, but you could just as easily use another computer or even that database file on a USB key. You'd actually specify the path to the file on the USB key, and then you could perform all the same remote operations. And one other thing, this user interface, it contains all of the documentation as well as a bunch of other features, but you can actually access the code from this tab here. So you can see that it has all these features in the user interface, but it's still rooted at the code here. Okay, so for an example, we'll actually take this, so we'll copy the address of the remote server, and so we'll go back to our command line, we'll go back to the file explorer, and we're going to make a new folder for this. So this is projects, this is our test repository, so you can see here I'm still in the test repository. I'm going to go back one folder, create a new directory, I'm going to call it the same as the example. I'm going to go into that folder, I'm going to use the Fossil clone command, and to do this I'm going to give it the address of the server, which is there, and then I need to tell it to put everything into a database file using the Fossil format. So we're going to call that file nailcode.fossil. So when we do this, it's going to go ahead, it's going to reach out to the server, and it's going to start receiving all of the packets of data. And then once it has all of them, it builds them into a complete repository. Now what's interesting is if I do Fossil UI, getting ahead of myself. So if we look here, I have the nailcode.fossil. I need to tell it that I want to use this directory as the working directory where all the files are going to show up. So Fossil open. You can see it's taken all of the files and pulled them out of that repository file, and if we do dir again, you can actually see all of the source code and make changes to it. And it's interesting, if you launch the user interface, you get the same window that you saw on the server, except now we're on localhost, and you get admin privileges. So you can make any changes that you like, but when you go to push them back to the server, any access that you don't have will be respected. Okay, so now that we have that, and let's look into the repository folder. You can see all of the source code. And just like before, we can access the timeline. So let's say I made some changes to a file and I made a commit. Before I'm allowed to push those changes back to the server and have a commit show up on the central server, I need to be able to authenticate myself. So in order to handle that, you actually you change the URL that you use. So if we do fossil settings, let's see, it's actually fossil remote URL, it's its own command. You'll see that is the address that we use to clone the repository. That's the web address of the server. Now what we're going to do is we're going to change that so that it also includes our username. So the username is something that you would have to set up with the server first. So remote URL, and then as before, when we were changing the settings, you actually, when it's run with no arguments, it just tells us what it is. But when it's run with an argument afterwards, this is going to update it to this new value. So the username on this server is Steven. So if I type this in and execute that, it's going to ask me for the password. So I'll do that. And then now, if I were to try and make a change, it would allow me to do that. So I'm not going to make a change to this repository, but maybe we'll set up a test repository to go through the pushing mechanism. One other thing is that if I were to try to make a commit right now, it would actually try to pull from the server first to make sure that the changes I make aren't going to conflict. That's actually something that, unless you're used to it, or if you're used to one method or the other, we're actually going to turn off that ability. So we're going to do fossil settings, and it's called auto sync. So here it's already been turned off, but if we go back to our test repository, it is turned on by default. So we're just going to turn that off with fossil setting auto sync off. And so now if we try to make a commit, it's not going to try to contact the server first. Okay. That should be all for now. In the next one we're going to get more in depth as to how to communicate with a remote server, including some of the configurations that don't necessarily get pulled when you make a pull on the source code itself.